expansive and expensive. An empire-building exercise or the creation of a new world trade order.
It's not a program dominated by China. It's the program by which China works with other countries.
Tentacles that stretch from China through Central Asia to Europe, to the Middle East and Africa, to India and Southeast Asia, over land and sea, through some of the world's most uncharted economic territories.
Defaults can always happen. Infrastructure is a risky business.
A project that, when finished, will have cost China and its partners trillions of dollars.
These are countries that need infrastructure. At the end of the day, money will drive this process forward.
Hello, I'm Stephen Engle. Welcome to a look at how the economic future of the world's oldest continuous civilization is evolving. A new dynasty that's being built from Beijing on the foundations of a project that is China's Belt and Road Initiative. Fast trains are one of the symbols of modern China, and so too is the pace at which the networks are being built. Top speed for the trains, more than 300 kilometers per hour. Rightly or wrongly, in the eyes of some perhaps, a reflection of China's Belt and Road ambitions.
Contrary to some other people's misconception, it's not a program dominated by China. It's the program by which China works with other countries, working with international financial institutions, multilateral development banks. So it's kind of cooperation. Unfortunately, some people misunderstood this as a kind of China program. China wants to take advantage of this to promote its own interests, which nothing could be further from the truth.
Views on China are often mixed. China builds up, again, enormous amounts of goodwill by building infrastructure. These markets are desperate for better metro systems, road systems, especially in these small to mid-sized economies where it's not easy building infrastructure. But at the same time, there are some concerns. And one refrain you often hear from locals, whether it's individuals or companies, is that Chinese companies will often win or come out on top.
In the next 10 or 15 years, or next 15 years, the world will invest about $90 trillion in infrastructure, mostly in emerging market and developing countries. So whilst that sum is a very large sum, it's only perhaps a couple of percent or less of the world's infrastructure investment, and it may be 3, 4, 5% of infrastructure investment in Asia. So it is very big, but we shouldn't overdo the magnitude of this in the context of infrastructure investment.
In its simplest form, China is looking to revive the roots of the ancient Silk Road with modern infrastructure, economic corridors by road and rail, linking major ports, dry and wet, to a maritime Silk Road that circles back to China. But the reality is much more complicated.
When we have 86 countries, it's very hard for me to say which country is not part of the Belt and Road initiative. And also, for instance, traditionally, when we think about maritime silkway, it might be westbound. But given the increased relationship between Asia and Latin America, it could be eastbound or southwestbound Africa. So you see, this is really an effort to promote regional and global integration.
It started out as unilateral policy, a focus on infrastructure, a focus on relieving excess supply back at home, but it's evolved significantly since then. And what we've seen is a growing ecosystem emerge around those infrastructure projects, a growing number of Chinese firms, not just state firms, private firms, all looking to participate, not just because of Belt and Road, but simply because the business opportunities as a result of the infrastructure spend are beginning to grow and to expand. So the policy today is very different to what we saw 5 years ago.
The Belt and Road Initiative is still very much in its early stages, being designed, crafted. Of course, there are some projects already through to Central Asia and the road down to Gwadar in Pakistan. But it's in the early stages. What we have seen so far is that there's a basic idea here, which is connecting the world to East Asia, particularly China.
Make no mistake, China's leadership is serious. The project has been enshrined in the Communist Party's constitution. And rise or fall, the Belt and Road Initiative will be seen as one of the great legacies of Xi Jinping's rule.
President Xi Jinping said very, very clearly, we are not going to build a garden in our backyard. We are interested in building the beautiful garden with beautiful flowers, which will be enjoyed by all of the nations in this world.
I think the BRI is central to the strategy of China under Xi Jinping. It's about the story of the rise of China and the reality of the size of China's economy and the reality of the size of China's trade. China is now almost equal in size in its economy to the United States. I mean, it depends how you measure it. Some measurements it would be bigger, much more trade than the United States. So the BRI is a story of the rise of China and the openness of China.
So in China, we say you aim high, you achieve something a little bit lower. You aim middle, you may achieve, the lowest. So the Chinese people are very much ambitious. But I would like to say China will be ambitious for the rest of the world.
There are 10 economies that by themselves account for nearly 70% of the Belt and Road GDP. Chinese firms have won some deals in these economies, but not too many. They are struggling. And in order to compete with the Korean, the Japanese, the American, the European, or the local firms, whether they're Indian or Turkish construction companies, Chinese firms are going to have to adapt. And that means collaborating with foreign or local partners.
If an infrastructure is built in Southeast Asia or Pakistan or Kazakhstan or linking up with Africa, first and foremost, that infrastructure should be shaped by the country in which it is. And that, I think, is extremely important in the whole execution of the idea. It's not a China diktat, it's not China saying this is what your infrastructure must look like. That would be a failure.
Maritime routes, new roads, new railways, new pipelines, new ports. China's superhighway is taking shape, moving its products to new markets and bringing the world's offerings into China. Up next, we'll weigh the risks versus rewards of doing business through uncharted territory. One of China's greatest challenges in realizing its Belt and Road Initiative will be paying for it. The capital scope for targeted projects ranges from $4 to $8 trillion. But it's how it manages its money across countries with high risk and poor credit profiles that provides one of the biggest unknowns.
Of the 70 or so countries China lists as partners, the sovereign debt of 27 of them are rated as junk or below investment grade. Another 14 of them, countries like Afghanistan, Iran, and Syria, are not rated at all.
Defaults can always happen. Infrastructure is a risky business in the early stages, and that's why it's so important to have the right kind of finance in the right place and the right scale in the right time, and that's what multilateral development banks try to do, to get involved in the early stages where it's risky and manage that risk.
See, the policy is very clear. The bank is inclusive. And we do not intentionally try to grab some people into this bank because it's ultimately the decision-making of the sovereign governments. And the door is open and we are inclusive. If they're interested in joining and working with other members, they are most welcome. But each and every sovereign government has its own ideas.
Too many government-to-government deals will be a concern. But again, the Belt and Road Initiative is evolving, and in its early stages, there were many government-to-government deals. Increasingly, these deals are profit-driven, done not just between state-owned firms and local firms, but private-owned firms. Particularly, we're seeing Chinese technology firms beginning to move into the Belt and Road markets and looking to tap what is a very market-driven consumer opportunity.
And what role should and will commercial banks play? Because they're risk adverse as well, but they're being driven by policy in many places.
Commercial banks have a very important role to play, particularly the foreign commercial banks, because they provide a robust due diligence process to project selection, project screening, and ultimately, of course, financing. Chinese officials recognize this. My conversations at the highest levels often echo sentiments around, well, we need the private banks to participate. We need the foreign banks to participate. We're not going to fund all these projects, but more importantly, we don't want to see white elephants. We want these projects to be viable.
Transparency and good governance, they're among the biggest challenges facing supporters of the Belt and Road Initiative. In Malaysia, a change in government has seen the new Prime Minister pare back some of the deals signed by his predecessor. And in countries like Sri Lanka, a debt default is steering the project somewhat off course.
A couple of countries, Sri Lanka is a good example. The Chinese financed a big port there, but it's actually not very useful. It's not economic, so now the Chinese have taken it over. And I think we'll see that in some smaller, more vulnerable countries. You know, infrastructure sounds nice, but if it doesn't generate a lot of business, then it's not good infrastructure.
You can see that Hambantota port was taken up without any proper economic feasibility study. Sri Lanka ended up getting into debt trap. As a result, the government of Sri Lanka had to hand over Hambantota port on 99-year lease, not just the port, but a vast area of nearly 6-7 square kilometers around it.
For India, which is the single biggest critic of the Belt and Road project, it's also a question of national security. China's biggest project to date runs the length of neighboring Pakistan to the port of Gwadar on the Indian Ocean.
When you talk about maritime Silk Road, the fact that today China has come to acquire control or controlling stakes in some 75 ports in 35 countries. Clearly, that's not being done just with commercial objectives in mind.
If you're very close to China, then there's more nervousness. India was a great example. But some of the ASEAN countries, they have to worry that there's a strategic element to this. China's lending a lot of money to Cambodia and Laos. It's clearly buying friendship from those two countries, and they provide a kind of veto within ASEAN. ASEAN operates on a consensus basis. So if you're worried about South China Sea, for example, you can count on Laos and Cambodia to stick with China, prevent ASEAN from doing anything that China would find objectionable.
We are witnessing a rapidly expanding presence of China in the Indian Ocean region, in the Indo-Pacific. We understand that China has desired to emerge as a major maritime power. We don't quarrel with that. But what's happening has implications for us.
I think that when you have a rising power like China, countries which are close neighbors like India, or countries which were the dominant economic power like the United States, have to think about their position. And they might get a bit uneasy because of the strength of China and the way in which China wants to, quite understandably and rightly in my view, link up with the rest of the world.
And the rest of the world now means much more than just routes along the ancient Silk Road. Globalization, connectivity, 21st century transport, and finance.
It's still very hard to get clarity around the financing of these projects. So even in countries such as Pakistan, for instance, many of these deals, or the financing arrangements around the deals are not made clear. So there are some concerns there that the Chinese, local governments are overpaying for Chinese contracts.
The initial set of Chinese loans over the last few years, a lot of it's gone to countries with very poor governance. Venezuela is a big borrower, Sudan, Angola, Iran, Pakistan. These are countries that may very well run into debt problems. But here's an important but. Indonesia is a big borrower, South Africa, Eastern African countries. So I think China has some good clients, some bad clients. And what you'd expect is that the projects would work out in the better managed countries.
At the same time, I would say there is a tendency for people to focus on deals that were done 5 years ago, but have only just come to market, whether it's a port or a rail project. When you're deeply involved, as we are in these projects, and you see some of the deals being done today, they look no different to those that any other multinational, any other large country would execute on. So that part, and it's the most exciting part, it's the one that promises the most over the coming years, that part's been overlooked.
Port operators like Hong Kong's modern terminals, the opportunities are massive. An estimated uplift of $2.5 trillion in trade over a 10-year period. Now, coming up after the break, we're going to get the word from Maersk giant APM Terminals as we continue to navigate the Belt and Road Initiative. We're here in Xi'an, the oldest of China's four great ancient capitals, home to the Han Dynasty and the Terracotta Warriors. But more importantly, on this trip, the easternmost point of the ancient Silk Road. It's here in Xi'an's Muslim quarter that you really can get a sense, and quite literally, a taste of the past. Much of the population here are descendants of Arab traders who traveled for months to get to China along the Silk Road.
It's no surprise to us that China, as the world's largest trading nation, wants to promote world trade, and we see very much that Belt and Road is an initiative that supports that. And I think that the overall goal is to develop an additional $2.5 trillion of trade over a 10-year period. So some of these projects could be very interesting to us as a transport and logistics provider. And broadly speaking, if the trade growth does come, that's more cargo for our ships, it's more throughput for our terminals, it's more units in our warehouses.
You've been in the shipping and the cargo business for decades. Where do you see the biggest infrastructure gaps?
You have to keep building the connectivity. Our own research, and I think quite a lot of academic research, shows that when transport connectivity improves, the cost of doing trade comes down, and that has a beneficial impact on growing trade. So our analysis says a 10% improvement in connectivity reduces trade costs by 3% and increases volumes by 5 to 9%. So we see a direct connection between these two things.
And APM Terminals should know. The transport and logistics arm of the seafaring giant Maersk has 78 port facilities in 58 countries, many of them passing along routes of the ancient Silk Road.
Very much we are looking and have quite some advanced projects actually within the Belt and Road scope. So for example in Vado in Italy, we've co-invested with COSCO and Qingdao Port Group to build a new container terminal. And we're also working with Chinese construction companies to build out new ports in Africa where we have some interest in investing together. So very much seeing the opportunities not just within Asia but along the whole scope of the Belt and Road to collaborate.
So what do you think should be the priorities in the opening days or years of this Belt and Road Initiative?
I think for us it's the transparency is the area where we would really like to see the improvement come, so that we can, very often today, projects are done and we only find out about them after the main players have already reached an agreement, and I think that's probably where the international companies would like to get involved more. The EU, I think, is very much communicating along the same lines in its feedback to China that this is an area where improving the transparency is critical to the future success of Belt and Road.
So, plenty of roadblocks along the way, but there's also a sea of opportunity. Trillions are to be spent. So who along the Belt and Road stand to benefit the most?
I think they're shifting toward better managed countries, and it's a more general financing of infrastructure. So countries such as Brazil or South Africa, East Africa, they have vast infrastructure needs, and there's a lot of potential for this to work out. So if you think of it as a Chinese master plan for where infrastructure should be, that's not going to work out. That's not realistic.
At the end of the day, money is the ultimate driver here. So if Chinese firms can provide elevated or construct elevated light rail projects, for instance, in India, if Indian players, whether it's Tata or other construction companies, believe there's an opportunity there to make money by partnering up with Chinese companies, then they'll do so. So at the end of the day, money will drive this process forward.
Well, I think the closest neighbours to China and those nations on the route to Europe will be the early beneficiaries. That means Central Asia and Southeast Asia. But I hope very much that the links to South Asia will strengthen, particularly to India, because the China-India relationship is the most important relationship in the world. And secondly, I hope that there will be strong benefits for Africa to link up with the big, fast-growing markets of the world, which are now Asia.
Actually, if you read President Xi Jinping's, I would say, monumental statement in the first meeting, he said Belt and Road Initiative would connect with the other initiatives proposed by many other countries. So we in ADB are very, very supportive of the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, when we are approached for financing the projects, we will have to see whether they meet our standards. For us, the three basic standards are as follows: financial sustainability, environmental protection, and the protection of the local people's interests.
By the mid-15th century, due largely to more efficient seaborne trade, as well as squabbles between the participating states, the original overland Silk Road began its decay. It was about the same time that the Forbidden City, here behind me, was being completed to serve as the home to Chinese emperors for the next 500 years. Now, the revival of the old route is indicative indeed of China's re-emergence as a global trading power.
By anyone's measure, China's Belt and Road Initiative is a massive project. Trillions are being spent on infrastructure, linking China to the world by road, rail, sea, and pipelines. Reinvigorating the ancient trade routes from China through Central Asia to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East to Southeast Asia and India. An ambitious upgrade which is now an ecosystem in itself.
We begin this program here in Mumbai, known as a gateway to India, a symbolic entry point to the world's largest democracy, but not so welcoming to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Two countries with massive economies, accounting for more than a third of the global population, but with a long history of mistrust.
Well, I think it's understandable that India is nervous about having this giant neighbor that's just growing so quickly, and it's frankly outpaced India in a lot of ways. So I understand India is nervous about this. It doesn't want China to be planning the Asian infrastructure. But there is potential for India to benefit if China's financing good infrastructure projects around the region.
Many of the countries which have gone in for Belt and Road projects, Sri Lanka for example, and some Central Asian republics, run the real risk of getting into a debt trap. Amongst India's immediate neighbors, Pakistan, Maldives, and Sri Lanka are the three countries which we think, in our assessment, can become highly indebted.
They've always been concerned about China because they share a border, and a contentious border, a disputed border, and they've always been concerned about Pakistan. So if the question is, should they be concerned about BRI, I think they'll be most concerned when it's touching upon countries that border them, where they have traditionally had their sphere of influence. So whether it's a rail line to Nepal, whether it's a port in Bangladesh, or a port in Sri Lanka, or CPEC, yes, they will absolutely be concerned about it.
At the heart of India's opposition is the biggest single project of the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which snakes its way from one of China's westernmost cities through the disputed territory of Kashmir all the way to the Arabian Sea.
Well, CPEC so far to date is probably the biggest single component of BRI. It's very important to Pakistan. China has, not overnight, but in a relatively short period of time, reduced, for example, the energy shortage that Pakistan has had, the electricity shortage. So it's very important to Pakistan recipient. It's also important to China because Pakistan has been an ally of China for a very long time. It's a counterfoil to India, and it gives them access to the Arabian Sea. So it also borders a sensitive area of China, which is Xinjiang province. So it's important for both parties that it actually succeed.
If I'm a commercial enterprise and I make an investment which is not viable, I take the hit and I move on. As a government, my concerns are not only financial. I can, for example, in case of Sri Lanka, I have a 99-year lease on a port right now, which sits very close to India and which sits right next to a major international shipping lane. I'm also investing $1 billion+ in Gwadar, a port in Pakistan, which is also not likely to be financially successful. So I can get these assets right now which are commercial ports, but which in the longer run can have other uses as well. We have already seen in case of Djibouti, which is debt ridden, most of which is owed to China, now put part of its territory for use by Chinese as a military base.
Some of this is definitely strategic. The corridor from China down through Pakistan, it's hard to see that this is very economic. You know, going over the Himalayas to get from China to Pakistan, that's really not very practical. So that seems like a strategic move on the Chinese part. I can understand why India would worry that it's being surrounded as China builds that infrastructure in Pakistan.
If you put all of India's rail tracks back to back, they would circle the globe 1.5 times. 8 billion passengers a year. That's the official number. It's much more if you add all the people who travel for free across this vast nation. Here at Mumbai's hub during crush hour, 7,000 crammed into trains made for just 1,700. The system is antiquated, in need of upgrade.
And I see the mood in India changing. You will have quite strong investment from the AIIB, which is investing, for example, in the Mumbai Metro, which is the city we are in, is an example of cooperation around India's infrastructure. Now, you don't have to call that the Belt and Road Initiative. That could have happened without the Belt and Road Initiative.
The reason why Belt and Road has been so enthusiastically taken up by many of India's neighbors, especially Sri Lanka, Nepal and Pakistan, is partly a failure on India's part to deliver connectivity to its own neighbors. If you look at India's trade with its immediate neighbors, with Pakistan it's obviously minimal because of historical reasons, but India has also been unable to develop any meaningful infrastructure and connectivity with Nepal in the last several decades. The similar case exists in case of Bangladesh, where we have very little connectivity either in terms of energy or in terms of goods transport. And the same thing is true in case of Sri Lanka as well.
Mumbai was one of the original stops along the ancient Silk Road. Its port remains the country's largest, accounting for almost half of all its container traffic. It's also home to the Indian Navy's Western Command, looking west across the Arabian Sea to Pakistan and the Middle East, and to the east, the riches of Southeast Asia, and ultimately, China.
So some of the defaults, such as Sri Lanka, are not surprising at all. You look at the size of the economy, you look at the kind of investments that have been made, and you also look at the individual projects. Hambantota port gets a traffic of, I think, 1 or 2 ships every week. So it's not surprising that the project has gone down under. And I think something similar is likely to happen in case of Gwadar, which is again about $1 billion+ is being invested.
If you're a recipient country in BRI, it doesn't matter where you are, and China comes along and you negotiate, let's say, appropriate terms for whatever the project happens to be, there aren't a lot of other competitors beating down your door. And so this has been China's huge advantage. They bring not only the funding, but also the expertise to actually execute. And that is a very compelling package for a recipient country. But the recipients do have to be careful of the financial terms.
One of the countries that stands to gain most from China's Belt and Road Initiative is Kazakhstan, where in the capital Astana, administrative hub of the world's largest landlocked country, a country locked between China and Russia at the center of a balancing act between geopolitics and economic advancement.
Astana is an ultra-modern city built on the oil riches of what is by far Central Asia's dominant economy. A city celebrating its 20th anniversary on the birth date of the country's one and only president. Nursultan Nazarbayev has ruled Kazakhstan since independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. Seen here opening Astana's International Finance Center, a bold move 5 years in the planning to link the region's capital markets, much like his country has embraced its role as a key overland pivot of China's Belt and Road Initiative.
The key agenda of the economic policy of the government is the diversification of the economy. diversification towards creation of new subsectors of our economy in a different industrial dimension, but also the services sector, and among these, the financial services. So we want to be the financial hub of the region. We want to help to the region to develop the economies, and I think in this terms, Kazakhstan in a very good track to deliver it.
We are naturally the first country that lies to the west of China as we go towards Europe. And we have built our own infrastructure. Even before the initiative was launched, we have built 2,500 kilometers of railroads to reconnect east and west of the country. So when the initiative was launched, this infrastructure came in handy. We were prepared, and we are now cooperating with the Chinese on implementing numerous projects. There is a program to implement 51 projects worth $28 billion in Kazakhstan, jointly with the Chinese. They are relating to Belt and Road Initiative, but not exclusively. So it's a very wide-ranging economic cooperation.
Of course, one of the key benefits for us is that we're a transit country. And transit is a very good way of making money and doing business. In our country, for example, we have finalized the Kazakhstan part of Western China, Western Europe superhighway, which is about 3,000 kilometers long. It costs us something like $3 billion US, and that one goes to the Russian border. Another route is taking us to the Caspian Sea, and to that end we have built a new port in Kuryk on the shores of the Caspian Sea. And that route takes us across the Caspian to Azerbaijan, Georgia, and then from Georgia to Turkey, and from Turkey to Mediterranean and further west. And yet another one is the railroad that takes us from the Caspian, from Aktau to Turkmenistan, then Iran, and to the Gulf. So we have diversified our transportation routes, and we have provided for various alternatives, not only going north, west, but also going south.
On Kazakhstan's border with China are plans to build the world's largest dry port.
Built on the Kazakh steppe, not far from what is known as the Eurasian point of inaccessibility, that's the furthest point on Earth from an ocean, nearly everything that crosses into the West by rail from China passes through here.
The Chinese invested into that 50-50 with us. So we have a train now that can travel from Lianyungan in the east of China through China to Khorgos, then through Kazakhstan and to Istanbul in about 2 weeks. And we want to decrease the traffic time, the transit time to about 12-10 days.
So this part of the world used to be the heart of the Silk Road for centuries and centuries in the past, and right now as we recreate the Silk Road in asphalt and rail now in steel, Kazakhstan again is recovering its place as the key crossroads in the heart of Eurasia.
Give us a sense of the sectors that will benefit in Kazakhstan.
When the maritime communication came in, it stole away the show, if you will. Now, gradually land communications are taking hold. The industries that stand to benefit the most are obviously construction, processing, petrochemistry. The products of petrochemistry are needed in road construction, but also agriculture and food processing. Already I can tell you that the volume of container transportation across Kazakhstan from China to Europe grows twice in size every year for the past 7 years, and it will reach 2 million containers by 2020. So Kazakhstan stands to gain about $5 billion in transit fees every year.
Just down the road from the port is what Kazakhstan and China are calling an international free trade zone. Dual cities on either side of the border, a planned strategic Silk Road city that for all intents and purposes for now lies in a no man's land.
During the Cold War, this whole area was a controlled military zone. The two towers you see behind me represent the borderline. I'm on the Kazakh side. The Chinese side is almost fully developed, but Kazakhstan says it has big plans to catch up.
Cargos is a gateway to the Chinese market, so we agreed between two governments, China and Kazakhstan, so we're going to develop the special economic zone regime, which will help us to develop the trade hub over there. So the idea is that in the Soviet Union time, probably it was bottleneck, and now we're going to kind of increase the breakthrough capacity for the goods coming in both directions.
But 5 years after it was first proposed, on the Kazakh side at least, this project remains a work in progress.
Some people have said that Kazakhstan will be the buckle of the belt, but there are challenges before that can happen.
As I said, we have built the infrastructure. We have also worked very hard with our other neighbors, such as Russia and Belarus, to establish the Eurasian Economic Union. We are prepared in terms of synchronized customs tariffs and synchronized railroad tariffs. So we have not only built hard infrastructure in those 2,500 kilometers of railroads, but we have also created soft infrastructure, if you will, removing barriers for trade.
From Kazakhstan in Central Asia to Southeast Asia. That's next as we continue to navigate China's Belt and Road Initiative. For the countries in ASEAN, China's Belt and Road Initiative offers massive opportunities where infrastructure is key to economic growth. From Indonesia to the Philippines, Myanmar to Laos, Malaysia to here in Thailand, projects worth hundreds of billions of dollars are underway to improve connectivity.
We can have the physical high-performance connectivity in place, then we can see that that would help spur activities in terms of commerce and investment.
This is one of the backbone of medium-term economic outlook for Indonesia. I'm sure starting next year, the productivity gain from the infrastructure that being developed will be start to kick in to accelerate our economic growth.
We are not going into building airports and hoping they will come. We are improving our airports because they are already currently congested. We are improving our ports because they are congested. We are improving our roadways. It helps us achieve our Build, Build, Build program. And second, because it promotes not only connectivity within our country, but also outside of our country.
Like many of its neighbors, Thailand is betting big on the Belt and Road, investing tens of billions with the help of China to turn its eastern provinces into an economic corridor, and billions more on projects like this, a high-speed rail from here in Bangkok all the way to China.
The mega station will serve as Bangkok's rail hub for fast trains heading north to China through Laos and south to Singapore through Malaysia, although that part of the journey is now in jeopardy. It will also link the country's 3 main airports to Thailand's Eastern Economic Corridor.
The EEC, we have planned it to be the catalyst, so to speak, of connectivity, not just in Thailand, but also with other countries, especially our neighboring countries. Now, China is to the north of us, so it's natural that the EEC can link up with the Belt and Road Initiative. You could practically see a corridor running north China, south through Thailand, and to ASEAN, all the way.
Each country has to look at their own interests, has to make sure that whatever loans they incur are affordable, not only to this generation, but to the subsequent generations. The 2 loans that we have negotiated, the first one is for a dam. It's $62.5 million. And the second one is for the development of a municipal water project. That's around $200 million. We are currently negotiating a larger loan, and this will be approximately $2.8 billion US, and this will be for a railway project. Again, improvement of a railway project that is already in a state of bad repair.
We have set up actually in Indonesia the priority infrastructure projects, and based on that we identify which project that we feel we can then propose to be included in the BIR. The biggest challenge, Haslinda, is really the execution. Out of the 50 at the moment, we only were able to utilize about 9, so we are still very far to go. So while the funding is there are also a number of requirements that we have to follow in order to get that.
Are there risks of unmanageable costs?
Oh, I think there are definitely many, right? I think this is not just about Belt and Road. As you know, Indonesia at the moment is in a reform process. A lot of the infrastructure projects that's happening right now has issues such as regulatory issues, licensing. We have obviously manpower. We have also land acquisitions issue. There's a number of also local issues, I think, that we also have to solve in order for this to be maximized.
Another of the key routes for China will be its corridor through Myanmar, and local issues there throw up all kinds of questions. The country borders China, India and Bangladesh, providing not only a channel to the Indian Ocean, but also overland west to the Indian subcontinent.
There are concerns over many aspects. Large infrastructure projects would incur a lot of indebtedness, and there's a lot of concern in this government over the risk of over-indebting the country and passing on that to the next generation. I think that's a positive thing to worry about, the fact that we're not just going all out in building things without regards for our budget position.
Welcome to Mombasa. Traders have been coming to Kenya's oldest city for centuries. The Arabs, the Portuguese, the British and Indians have all tried their hand at making a fortune here. The latest are the Chinese. We'll explore their grandiose ambitions, asking whether dreams in far-off Beijing match those on the African continent.
Mombasa is seen as the gateway to East Africa. At least 5 landlocked nations, including Uganda and Rwanda, rely on this port to get goods in and out. The Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, or SGR, is the nation's biggest infrastructure project since independence from Britain in 1963. Kenya paid $3.8 billion. China arranged the financing and built what is the start of a rail network that promises to open up the passage of people and goods deep into the heart of the continent. The SGR cuts the journey to Kenya's capital to 5 hours, down from more than 8 for cargo transported by truck.
The Belt and Road Initiative is, I believe, a good initiative for the region. The railway link from Mombasa to Nairobi, I have reservations about the price that was paid for the rail link. However, the fact that we have a rail link now is creating immense opportunities, leading to reduction in supply lead times and so on. That's what we wish for.
There's nobody else who can compete with the Chinese investment into infrastructure. However, when we look at it from an African perspective or Kenyan perspective, investments coming in to build our infrastructure are very welcome from wherever they're coming, whether it's American, whether it's Chinese, or whether it's European, because they need to make us more competitive.
The market is there, but to get connectivity, to get our products out there is a problem. So we hope that through BRI that these markets can be opened up, not only to China, but to all other countries within BRI. And that's what we are hoping for.
Better transport links are vital if regional expansion is not to hit the buffers. The IMF forecasts that the East Africa community will see growth of 6.2% in 2019. Mombasa Port itself is expanding to meet the challenge.
The equivalent of 1.2 million 20-foot containers pass through this port every year. What's more, that figure is expected to grow by 3 to 5% per annum.
For business, the potential is blindingly obvious. So far, execution has been the source of a litany of complaints. Sure, the containers get to the capital quicker. The trouble starts when they get there and when the bills arrive. The government says it's listening and is determined not to create a very expensive white elephant. Sachin Gudka's presses roll out billions of labels each year. People in supermarkets around the world are unwittingly familiar with some of them.
There are 7 cargo trains a day coming in, bringing 150 containers a day into Nairobi from Mombasa, so that's almost 800 to 1,000 containers a day, which all used to get put onto the single-lane road from Mombasa to Nairobi. Tremendous congestion, fatalities, and so on. However, Kenya has not properly addressed the bottleneck at the inland container depot in Nairobi, and it is heaving with containers. So the congestion within Nairobi is hurting business.
Do you use it?
Yes, we are all
even though it's more expensive?
In fact, we were kind of forced to by the government.
So logistics is always two-way, right? From Mombasa going all the way to Rwanda, and then of course later on it can go all the way to West Africa. As we speak today, there is no railway or roadway going through to West Africa, and that can be done very easy to expand it. However, when we talk about competitiveness, we're also talking about return logistics going back from Kigali all the way to Mombasa, all the way to China, and we could have that two-way logistics becoming competitive. This is so key for all our countries to have export products and export into those markets so that we're competitive both ways.
Bidco is East Africa's leading producer of edible oils. It also makes detergents and other consumer products. With factories in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania and Madagascar, it sells into 18 regional countries. Chairman Vimal Shah is cautiously optimistic about the wider impact of Chinese investments.
I think there is no doubt about one thing, that China wants to do much more trade, right? Whether we call it economic dominance or whatever, they have a competitive edge today. Therefore, if they start bringing in their industries here, to produce here, to sell to the West, what it does to Africa is not that it's going to be ownership, it's going to be jobs. And it creates jobs here.
In your grow, grab and sustain your number one position, does this worry you?
For us as a company, Bidco, we're not worried because we don't see these goods that we make here, we don't see these coming from China. In fact, China is a good market for some of the consumer goods. With its population, China, India, both, with their populations, they will need much more food. They will need to have a lot more of products, and that's what Africa can do. So we've got to look at the competitive advantage for Africa and say, fine, what are the products that we can then export into China using the same Belt Road Initiative?
How much do you currently then sell to China or India?
Zero.
This glass half full attitude is often countered by fears that all this hugely expensive infrastructure is simply a fast track for China to exploit new markets while leaving African countries swimming in debt. There have also been complaints about transparency. For example, how China Road and Bridge Corporation was given the contract to operate the line for 10 years and there was no tender process. Beijing's African enterprise is really based on trade and not benevolence. It's also inextricably linked to the way the country sees itself in the future, in a geopolitical sense and beyond. Meanwhile, for Kenya and its neighbors, they see a medium-term locomotive for growth. But down the track, things look a lot more murky. Some are raising questions about the level of indebtedness or whether or not it's a win-win relationship. Coming up, we have a look at whether it can be that or it'll be a situation where there's only one victor. After Mombasa, containers end up here in Nairobi. Now that's not the end of the story, it's the start of a more profound one. Opportunities for new markets stretch beyond Kenya's capital, beyond Kenya itself, to Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, or even Europe. The question is, does it all come at a price that they can afford?
Our leaders are letting Africa go to China. That's my view. I think we need to do it in moderation, while at the same time maintain our country. There's quite a lot we can learn and gain from China, quite a lot. But I think we need to do it to some extent, not get China to come and take over our country.
We do not interfere in the internal affairs of African countries, impose our will on African countries, attach any political condition on the economic aid for Africa, nor do we seek selfish political gains in investment and financing cooperation with Africa.
China is pushing back against criticism. The Belt and Road Initiative loads up partner countries with debt. It also refutes claims it's aimed at strengthening Beijing's global influence. The Chinese president maintains the initiative is a tool for common prosperity. While roads, rail and port infrastructure are desperately needed in Africa, the continent's debt pile is rising. About $12 billion in Chinese loans were given in 2015, compared with just over $100 million in 2000. That's according to the China-Africa Research Initiative. And then there are Chinese companies, many of which are state-owned, sourcing infrastructure projects in cooperation with African governments. Some do it with financing from the Export-Import Bank of China, otherwise known as Exim Bank. It's a state-funded, state-owned policy lender. Kenya's SGR between Mombasa and Nairobi was 90% funded by such a loan.
I don't think, based on the quantity of cargo, the construction cost, the service cost of the loan, and in addition to the cost of running the train one way and the other, it is not possible for the SGR to pay for itself. I mean, will the people of Kenya pay back the loan? Obviously we'll have to, and the only way we are going to do that is actually having to suck taxes from other sectors and use that to service this loan.
A further $1.5 billion for the next stage of the line is largely funded by a loan from Exim Bank. An extension to Kisumu will cost $3.8 billion, and Kenya is now asking China for half of that as a grant instead of a loan. What's more, to connect the line all the way to Uganda, another $4.9 billion may be needed.
Critics of Belt and Road have said that these countries are mortgaging their futures. This is going to lead to a huge amount of indebtedness, which will lead to default, which will then ultimately lead to China actually controlling vast swathes of these economies.
I don't think that will happen. Everyone's spoken about debt trap diplomacy, that it's a sinister move by China to get control of strategic assets. For example, Djibouti is pretty indebted, and they've put up a military base in Djibouti. Could they get Mombasa port, for example, if Kenya defaults on its railway line debts and so on? It's a very unlikely scenario, because the overall trade benefits and that we will see emerging from this, and the investment and trade benefits we will see, will supersede these. I am aware that countries often overpay for the infrastructure. However, the infrastructure in this case was necessary, and I think overall it will be a benefit to the economy.
And infrastructure builders like China Communications Construction Company see plenty of opportunities to boost their own growth, as well as those of African nations. It is the parent of the company that built and operates the SGR.
I think the whole African continent has opportunity for development. There's a large young workforce, but economic growth is slow, so there are few good job opportunities. Right now, I think they're like China back in the 1970s, and given China's development through the years, I think Africa will also embrace development opportunities.
But the steady influx of Chinese companies and workers have fueled accusations the wealth and opportunities are not being shared with the local community.
I think that definitely if you look at the financing for a lot of these projects is Chinese banks, if you look at the contractor is a Chinese contractor. So if you're looking for the big ticket, so the person who's receiving the $4 or $5 billion check is likely to be some sort of Chinese entity.
And questions about transparency and corruption won't go away.
I think this is a big debate going on, whether this Chinese debt is serviceable or not, and the issue around whether it's becoming too heavy in indebtedness, and therefore ultimately it'll end up in Chinese hands and they will own the country. I think what is important here is to note that there should be no government guarantees for the infrastructure that's being put up. This should be done on a private sector basis where they come in, run it, operate it and finance it, and ultimately transfer it at a price so that they get a good return out of it as a commercial enterprise.
Look at it both ways. Short-term, painful, long-term gain. But the Kenyan citizen right now is carrying a very big burden in terms of taxes because we want to pay for the loans that we are taking. And it's interesting that we're still taking in more. It's a wait-and-see situation because also, unfortunately, we have issues of corruption in the country, which really have diverted some of these resources from what they were meant to be. Or we are seeing something that was supposed to be a really big enterprise or really big project. We're hoping, but it comes out to be a bit substandard than what we expected.
Regarding the standard gauge railway, obviously there are many things that actually have not been answered, including some of the contracts that have been entered into. The payments, of course, the payment plan and everything is quite clear, but the real costs and whether the costing of individual pieces of equipment and individual construction sites and how it all adds up is something that's still being questioned, and I think it's not as transparent as would be preferable for a piece of infrastructure that is close to 5% of our gross domestic product.
The real question is, are those loans used in the right manner for the right projects that will generate the right type of revenues for the African country? Again, it comes back to the need for the African countries to develop their own perspectives holistically, not project by project, on what infrastructure they need, for what projects, what is the best way to finance these. And then to engage with different partners, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the World Bank, on how to go about building these projects.
Welcome back to Belt and Road, China's trade superhighway. People come to markets like this one in Nairobi to get the best deal that they can. It's like anywhere else. Ultimately, no one is forced to buy. By the same token, many people have accused governments of not haggling hard enough with Beijing.
It's clearly not a two-way street. I think it's very, very profitable for the Chinese farms that are involved in actually this. They're going to make very handsome profits from this, no doubt. But I mean, the ethics of it notwithstanding, but I would say, well, they negotiated the best deal they could get. And so as Kenyan taxpayers, we should be actually asking tougher questions of our own administrators and our own governors. How could you, in broad daylight, make a deal such as this?
Kenyan companies also want to make handsome profits, but some sectors are frustrated.
We export quite a lot of our products, agriculture products, to the European market, but the Chinese market is really untapped. There are some protocols we are supposed to sign as a government of Kenya so that it can support our growers to take the products there, but it has not done that.
Our manufacturing capacity is not fulfilled because we are not fully competitive yet, and we do need government intervention to urgently address our competitiveness. Secondly, there are no preferential trade agreements also with China.
At the same time, both manufacturers and Kenya's leaders see the increasing numbers of Chinese firms as a positive.
We welcome the Chinese manufacturers to the manufacturing fold. Manufacturing is part of the Big Four agenda driven by the government, and we really need as much investment, both local direct investment as well as foreign direct investment, to onshore into Kenya and create a very strong manufacturing hub.
President Uhuru Kenyatta's Big Four agenda aims at boosting manufacturing to 15% of GDP from around about 9% by 2022. Agriculture, health and home construction are the other industries targeted for growth.
Just the extent of manufacturing that we see is creating thousands of jobs, direly required jobs across the continent, and you're seeing it in increasing numbers. The innovation that we are seeing the Chinese bring to Africa, sometimes seemingly quite simple, but where they recognize Africa to be a key market, they are innovating for our markets.
BITCO's chairman says local companies can grab opportunities if African leaders pull together.
BRI is seen by many as being a one-way street. You want it to be a two-way street. So you want access to the Chinese market. You think you will get that?
So I think this is where we must look at Africa becoming more productive, more producing goods that add value, add more value to our products, and really become emerging.
And that's the great hope. Will it happen?
I think it's up to us as Africans, right, to make it happen, to make sure that we do it in the right manner and become competitive. Today, the folly is that intra-African trade is at such a low, we're actually putting up more and more barriers within Africa against each other. And we're allowing China or America or Europe to come in, duty-free. And I would take all the leadership in Africa to say, unite, because we've talked about OAU, you've talked about the African Union, but it's still talk. It's called NATO, no action, talk only. We got to get out of that and make it happen.
China's Africa policy has shifted, now drawing a clearer line between official foreign policy and private commerce. Beijing created a new development agency in April 2018. It is expected to play a larger part in government strategy as Exim Bank's role reduces.
It's one of the criticism China gets a lot, which is that it is offering these loans. Those loans are originated by the African countries. They are the ones asking for it. They may have a dream in terms of the nature of the relationship, but I do not think they are trying to shape the future of Africa.
That's not to say aid and lending won't be influenced by commercial interests. Interests which some say still have access to resources at their heart. Chinese companies continue to see an abundance of opportunity in the continent's rebounding economy and a green light to raise their presence there under the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative.
While China sees huge investment opportunities, what about your average portfolio manager or your retail investor? Can they also come along for the ride?
If you want to invest directly in the sort of Belt and Road Initiative, that you can't do it directly, but basically what you're investing is somewhere where perhaps it's a hub for African and international companies. So as the environment gets easier, as say for example the cost of power comes down, then it becomes more easier or more economic to manufacture goods. So that's the story. So I think for Kenya and for East Africa as a whole, you sort of sell the story of access, not necessarily large minerals or any sort of natural resources that you get elsewhere in Africa. So I think for us it's a sort of a portal to the rest of Africa. That's the way that we would look at it.
There's also paying for the thing, isn't there?
I think in the long term, you have new towns being opened up, you have people who can do more commerce, who can ship goods, and also what it's doing is moving perhaps the industrial heartland of Kenya away from parts of Nairobi to other parts of the country. So you can manufacture in Naivasha once the planned industrial hub is set up there, and you can then export straight out to Mombasa.
And what of complaints Chinese companies are sweeping up large government contracts in Africa, and White House concerns about challenges to US influence?
I think one thing you got to tell very clearly, the Chinese have a serious advantage in execution. This is where the Europeans, who had a head start for the last 50, 60 years in Africa, did not do much. The Americans, they ignored Africa. They did not pay attention to it. And when the Chinese came in, I think they've done serious execution on the ground. They're giving you better infrastructure at lower prices, and they've upped their game. I think tide aid is gone. Now it's execution. You can call it economic dominance. You can call it economic, colonization. But Africa needs infrastructure now, and it needs to have it done rapidly.
That's always been the problem with foreign aid. It's ended up in people's pockets, hasn't it? Not always, but...
The past was all about aid, and aid gives us AIDS. It's called the always in debt syndrome. Okay? And we don't want to have that. What we want to have now is make us more competitive, ease our doing business. However, we need to make sure that everything has a clear code of ethics. It's all being done on above board, and there's nothing that's being siphoned off.
The stakes are high for both sides. For China, the mouth-watering potential of new markets, they're writ large. Less obviously, though, is how to tap them and not be seen as the next colonizer. For the recipients, Beijing's initiative offers a multi-generational change. China may well be a partner, but it's also a competitor. Factories like this one can compete with efficient Chinese ones. Sadly, that's not the norm. When thrown the gauntlet, many have wilted. The choice ultimately is theirs.
The ancient port of Piraeus is in a hurry to be the #1 port in the Mediterranean and in Europe, propelling it on its journey, its pivotal role in China's Belt and Road Initiative. From Greece to Germany, Brussels to London, we'll explore the European connections in China's grand plan.
COSCO is one of the world's biggest shippers and port operators, and that status has put it at the forefront of the Belt and Road Initiative. China has called Piraeus a dragon's head, a strategic transit hub linking maritime and overland routes. state-owned COSCO took over management of Pier 2 in 2009 under a 35-year concession, pouring millions of euros into upgrading infrastructure and building a third pier. In 2016, Greece, mired in its debt crisis, sold a controlling stake in the Port Authority to COSCO. For 370 million euros and a promise to invest at least 350 million more, COSCO cemented Piraeus' place in Beijing's New World Order. The port has been a success. Bloomberg Intelligence says COSCO was in the right place at the right time. Piraeus handled more than 4 million 20-foot containers or equivalent last year, making it the third busiest in the Mediterranean and number 7 in Europe, according to Port Economics. That's growth of almost 200% compared with a decade earlier. The port's managing director says getting to this point hasn't been plain sailing.
This is a full competitive business. Everybody is do his best in order to win the support from the different carrier. We get benefit from the One Belt One Road initiative, but not financial support for sure. What we get is because the One Belt One Road initiative will create more trade opportunity. And this trade opportunity as a carrier and as a terminal, we win the benefit from that.
Chinese investment has supercharged Piraeus Port, but China's clout has also raised concerns that local businesses could be squeezed out.
Almost all the companies in Greece are small, medium enterprises. They listen to the fear. They're afraid that these huge companies will take their business from their hands.
Business groups say initial antagonism has largely turned to acceptance and the hunt for opportunity.
There are a lot of people that they are not satisfied because they thought we could also exploit this port by ourselves. Of course, there are some people that blame Chinese that they took advantage of the Greek crisis. But on the other hand, we very well know that the rules of business is that when you find an investment in good price, you go for it.
It's a catalyst, it's an opportunity for all of us to start negotiating how we will invest. Piraeus is a port. The supply chain and logistics are hinterland. And hinterland is where we can invest, where we can take advantage, where we can use tools like creating clusters, like creating growth of volumes in order to produce wealth.
But the Belt and Road-fueled push of Chinese firms across Europe has also stoked fears about China's so-called soft power reach and geopolitical ambitions. Chinese state-owned firms now control around 10% of Europe's container terminal capacity, according to the International Transport Forum. The European Commission says it welcomes the Belt and Road Initiative, but with caveats.
There are two major issues which we want to make sure that happens. All those projects financed by China and the others should be economically and environmentally sustainable. And the second, especially the calls for tender should be competitive and open for everybody. We want to be part of this project, but all the concrete investments must be reasonable.
And there are other concerns beyond simply how investments are implemented.
The European Union in particular is very concerned about China trying to divide and conquer Europe through the Belt and Road. There are countries in Central, South, Eastern Europe that are leaning forward because they haven't recovered from the global financial crisis as other countries have, and they really want to take advantage of these Chinese offers for assistance and infrastructure development. And so it's those countries, many of those countries that we see are susceptible to receiving the benefits of the Belt and Road and then turning around and basically taking steps and actions that support China in other venues and in political fora. And that's where I think European leaders are growing concern.
In areas where you need unanimity voting inside the EU and which are sensitive, the Chinese just need to own, so to speak, one government out of 28 to block common resolutions in a number of areas.
What do you say to those people who are concerned that aligning yourself so closely with Chinese state-owned companies like Costco creates a dependency for a country like Greece?
For Greece, in Greece, as Greek, we need investments. We need foreign investments. If these investments they have come from China, they are mostly welcome for me. If they could come from Germany, it could be also very welcome, or United States.
Coming up, we go to Germany, where the CEO of Siemens tells us why he thinks ignoring the Belt and Road is more of a risk than getting on board.
And if you have an initiative, good or bad, right or wrong, well perceived or not, which covers 70% of the global population, you better take that seriously.
While Piraeus is China's main maritime link into Europe, Duisburg port here in Germany, the world's largest inland port, is central to China's overland ambitions. Every week, trains loaded with Chinese goods arrive here and they lock into a logistical web that transports toys, clothes and electronics to consumers across the continent. Duisburg's network of rail and waterways made the city an inland port a nexus for industry. Its history is firmly planted in coal and steel. With those sectors on the decline, the CEO of logistics hub operator Duisport is hitching his wagon to the Belt and Road Initiative. It began with a rail link from Hewlett-Packard's manufacturing center in China's southwestern city of Chongqing.
It all started at least 6-7 years ago. The first train was a dedicated train from Hewlett-Packard into Duisburg. And then we saw the chance with respect to this turntable and hub positioning, acting from Duisburg to China and vice versa as the distribution hub for Europe.
Since then, the value of goods going between China and Europe by rail has surged, as has the number of freight services, according to the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, with the Belt and Road being a major driver. Every week, about 30 trains from China arrive here in Duisport. The Chinese want to increase that number to about 50 by 2020. They also want to decrease the amount of time it takes. It currently takes about 12 days to get from China to Germany. They want to cut that down to 10 or fewer. A fast route into Europe has become more important with the rise of industrial production in China's southwestern regions. Cities like Chongqing and Chengdu are far from shipping routes on the coast. At the same time, Duisport seeks out projects with cities and companies linked to the Belt and Road Initiative to strengthen its business, with hopes there will be knock-on effects for its home city.
We have built partnerships, strategic partnerships, for instance, with China Merchant, which is one of the biggest group. We are very close to a strategic partnership with Costco, with the Costco group. They have all very concrete intentions. And you can imagine that part of the strategic partnership is also an involvement here in Duisburg. You've developed this relationship with your Chinese counterparts, and that opens up other opportunities for you across Europe. Our clients are global, and we have to check where will be the new trading routes, or how can we optimize the transportation chains. That is the reason, for instance, why we are investing with the largest logistic group in Turkey, the Akas Group, 50 kilometers outside of Istanbul, and to build a rail port. Or why we are interested in looking for a rail port investment in Trieste, because I think Trieste will become a very important port in the maritime One Belt, One Road link, and then serving for the southern part of Europe. The German Chambers of Commerce and Industry tells Bloomberg many members see indirect advantages from improved logistics powered by Belt and Road Initiative projects. But only about 30% see opportunities to profit directly at this point. There's also a level of caution.
Some of our major players, they are already involved, but there's only a few. And then I have to mention also the risk or the complaints about the bidding process, and it is not yet evolved that we can say it is transparent, it is inclusive, it's non-discriminatory, and it is respecting standards, what should be good standards when it comes to public procurement tenders.
Well, that's interesting because in China, of course, the Chinese will stress that this is an initiative that is open to all, that it is transparent, but the reality on the ground is different to that.
We don't have an overview. Where is the next project and where can competitors participate? If there is the wish that also German companies, that other European companies can participate, then we need more transparency and we have to sit at one table in order to discuss.
Siemens is one of the major German players that have embraced the initiative. The conglomerate generated revenue of more than 7 billion euros in China in 2017, about 9% of the total, and it's looking to deepen the relationship. Like Dusport, the conglomerate is hammering out new paths for future growth after difficult times. The global shift to renewable energy sources means Siemens' power plant equipment unit, once a flagship, has suffered a protracted slowdown.
So we have a structural challenge to master. And that means you master it by innovation, but you also master it by finding new ways of doing business, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, where obviously almost 90 countries are being part of, and most of them don't have a sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy. So there is opportunities there.
Those with concerns about the initiative say that some of the Chinese companies that you're potentially partnering with, they don't have the same levels of corporate governance in terms of standards that you do. There are concerns around transparency, the susceptibility of some of these Chinese firms to things like corruption. Do you expose yourself to risks, and is it a price worth paying, essentially?
Well, we obviously wouldn't pay such a price at all because it's just a no-go. I mean, if and that's true for any economy in any country, you know, in this case, if China wants to play an international role, as the aspiration has been announced, they need to adhere to international standards. And should there be any deficits due to the lack of experience how to handle it, they've got the perfect partner with Siemens because we've learned it the hard way, but we know it now.
Do you see China as a competitor or a partner for the European economy?
Both. I think this is, in today's world, there is not this thing, either you're a competitor or partner or somebody else. You can be either way, depending on what value you can create to the specific project. China has always been a long-term thinker, and I believe if the Western world doesn't get its act together on how it designs free trade and how it interacts also in solving problems, maybe China just says, well, I've got 90 countries with 70% of the world's population. Maybe I just declare that BRI to be the new WTO. So you need to be very mindful about what we deal with here, because most of the economic and political power shifts go with the amount of people in a country. And if you have an initiative, good or bad, right or wrong, well perceived or not, which covers 70% of the global population, you better take that seriously.
If any European company can make a success of profiting from China's Belt and Road Initiative, it is Siemens. Infrastructure is in the company's DNA, and its ties to China run deep. But that success will be dependent on European leaders and their ability to persuade China to make the initiative compatible with Western business norms. That's coming up.
For many economies and businesses across Europe, the Belt and Road Initiative can offer new directions for growth. It also opens the way for Chinese companies. However, as we discover in this Bloomberg special feature, there's increasing pushback in the corridors of power in Germany, France, and across the European Union.
The Greek debt crisis provided an opening for China to bolster its maritime links into Europe via the Piraeus port. Winning over Europe's lawmakers, though, is proving more of a challenge.
When the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced in 2013, we saw very strong support from Europe. I think there was a huge amount of interest in how could European countries benefit. We saw, however, in 2017, much of that enthusiasm begin to wane.
The EU's doctrine currently is that it has a constant offer to China to come and join and a constant wish to come and join, and that's even clearer at the level of some member states. But on, shall we say, our terms, at least on transparent terms, which is a condition that most Chinese projects, except those financed by AIIB, do not fulfill at present.
L'Europe doit toujours défendre ses intérêts stratégiques.
The European Commission has been working on tightening investment screening and rolling out a coordinated approach across the bloc. Currently, fewer than half of EU member states have rules to allow review of foreign direct investments.
What is our priority at the moment is to make sure that all those potential projects have a level playing field, that financing comes from the normal competition like what is the case here in Europe.
There's obviously an appetite in the European Union now for greater oversight of Chinese investments. To what extent is that going to impact the Belt and Road Initiative?
There is a rising understanding amongst our member states that as much as we want to be open destination for foreign direct investments, as we are probably the most open market in the world, we must know who is investing and for what purposes.
There are also moves to reduce unanimity voting to diminish members' veto powers, particularly on political and human rights issues.
We have seen efforts where China has gained strategic influence in countries through the benefits of the Belt and Road to those countries, building infrastructure and helping out with development assistance, and then using that influence as an advantage for China in terms of its international efforts or in a way that helps China politically. For example, both Greece and Hungary, large recipients of Belt and Road efforts by China, stepped forward to block a statement in the EU that would criticize China in the South China Sea.
The EU is also sharply aware of China's increasing investments in the nearby Western Balkans and Eastern Partnership countries. It's reaching out with a trans-European network for transport done, quote, the European way. Meanwhile, infrastructure builders like China Communications Construction Company and their subsidiaries are forging ahead with deals in those regions. In a rare interview with a Western media organisation, CCCC chairman Liu Qitao told Bloomberg he sees potential in Europe despite tighter scrutiny of Chinese investments.
We have principles when choosing investments. The project must meet the highest standards of environmental protection and bring benefit to the country's economic and societal development and people's livelihoods. We've gone through experiences when governments change, they put our projects on hold and review them again. As long as they're good for the country and they're a win-win, everyone will go ahead. Some media have different views, but I think it's because of a lack of understanding.
The European Union still hasn't officially signed off on the Belt and Road Initiative. They point to concerns around the transparency of the bidding process, around environmental issues. Are those concerns justified, do you think?
We need to promote mutual understanding. And in this respect, we also need to work with companies in Western countries, including those in Europe. If we can strengthen our cooperation, I think transparency will increase. So we're working with Europe on many projects.
I'm curious, how do you respond to allegations of corruption and fraud that have been levelled at your company and some of its projects involved and linked to the Belt and Road Initiative?
We don't allow and do not have any corrupt behaviours related to any official, because we know that this kind of corruption is not going to help with the company's sustainable development. And, as a listed company, we're subject to market supervision. If there's corrupt behaviour, the company is finished. On this, we are very clear.
Because critics of the Belt and Road Initiative still point to what they would say is a lack of transparency around some of the projects, what they would say is lack of hiring of local labour versus Chinese labour, and then ultimately many of these projects leave the countries heavily indebted to China. That would be the criticism. There is some truth in that criticism, is there not?
On the whole, I think the situation will become more transparent as the Belt and Road Initiative progresses. On the issue of pushing up debt, some countries do have relatively higher borrowing. I don't think that's scary, as long as the country's economy is growing enough to digest it. It's important to see whether the debt-funded projects are good for the country's economic development. Of course, I think it's necessary for developed nations to offer financial aid to countries that lack development capability. As for labour, currently my overseas ratio is at least 1 to 10. In my company, there's 1 Chinese person employed for every 10 foreigners. The labour cost of a Chinese employee is much higher than that for a local. Many developing countries are still catching up, and their cost of labour is lower than ours. Therefore, from the company's perspective, we want to localise as much as possible, hire local people, and use fewer Chinese. I can't say there are no problems or that we're perfect, but the reality is it's not as people say either. I think it's because of a lack of understanding.
For both Europe and China, the potential for business opportunities around the Belt and Road Initiative are significant. Yet too often, a lack of transparency is stoking concerns, fueled by the fact that many of the big Chinese companies involved are state-owned.
China needs to realize that the way that it sees its Belt and Road Initiative is not necessarily the way other countries see their Belt and Road Initiative. This is very important for China. It is now President Xi Jinping's flagship international program. It's embedded in the Chinese constitution. The international community, I think, should look at the Belt and Road Initiative and figure out where countries can partner with China, where they will maintain and meet the international standards that we hold so dearly. And where they're not, we ought to be stepping forward to put credible alternative proposals forward that maintain those high international standards, that have transparency, sustainability of projects, and have the labor and environmental standards that we care so deeply about.
Europe's leaders are trying to remain open-minded about the potential opportunities around China's Belt and Road Initiative. But it's clear that locking in full EU support will require Beijing to translate rhetoric into reality, particularly around issues of transparency, sustainability, and inclusiveness. Some European firms are hungrily eyeing dividends, but those are likely still years away. I'm Tom Mackenzie. Thanks for watching.